I sat in a ballroom filled with investors and polished smiles when my own son lifted a microphone and turned me into a joke. $1 for lunch with my boring mom. He laughed, as if my life were a punchline meant to entertain his colleagues. In that suspended silence, I felt decades of sacrifice collapse into a single humiliating moment. No one raised a paddle, no one met my eyes, and just when the shame became unbearable, a voice from the back of the room changed everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Linda Harper. I am 64 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wake up each morning without anyone needing me. I live in a small coastal house in Tacoma, Washington, where the windows face the gray expanse of Puget Sound, and the tide moves in and out with a patience I am still learning to understand. For 35 years, I worked at the Seattle Public Library. I believed libraries were sanctuaries, places where people could sit quietly and feel less alone in the world. I watched children discover stories that widen their imaginations, and elderly patrons linger over newspapers just to hear the sound of other lives moving around them. I liked being part of that quiet exchange. It felt useful. It felt meaningful. My husband, Daniel, was a marine engineer who spent more time at sea than on land. 12 years ago, a mechanical failure and a winter storm took his life off the coast of Alaska. After that, my world narrowed to a single purpose: raising our son, Jason. I worked extra shifts, skipped vacations, and ignored the small, persistent dreams that once belonged to me. Stability mattered more than ambition. Security mattered more than fulfillment. Jason grew into a man I hardly recognize, from the boy who once built blanket forts in our living room. He is now a client relations executive at a venture capital firm in downtown Seattle, the kind of firm that occupies glass towers reflecting clouds and ambition in equal measure. I remember standing across the street once, watching him stride through revolving doors in a tailored suit and feeling a fierce pride that tightened my chest. He moved through that world as if he belonged to it. I'd only ever visited it. After I retired, I moved south to Tacoma, to a modest house near the water. The air here smells faintly of salt and wet cedar. On clear mornings, Mount Rainier rises in the distance like a painted backdrop. On foggy days, the horizon disappears entirely, and the world feels suspended between sea and sky. I walk along the shoreline most mornings, listening to the low horn of passing ferries and the rhythmic hush of waves against stone. Retirement was supposed to feel like rest. Instead, it feels like standing in a doorway without knowing which room to enter. My days are quiet. Grocery trips, folded laundry, a cup of tea cooling beside me, and afternoon light drifts across the floor. Without the routines that once defined me, time stretches and softens in ways that feel unfamiliar. Jason calls once or twice a week. Our conversations are efficient and warm in the way polite exchanges tend to be. He tells me about meetings, investors, deadlines. I tell him the weather, the neighbor's new fence, the herons that visit the shoreline at dusk. We speak kindly, but there are long pauses where something deeper used to live. In the evenings, I stand by the window and watch the tide recede into darkness. The house is so quiet that I sometimes hear my own breathing echo faintly in the hallway. For most of my life, I was needed by someone. Now, for the first time, I'm not certain who I am when no one is waiting for me. I tell myself this is simply a new chapter. Yet as I watch the water fade into night, I feel the faint stirring of something inside me, as if a part of my life has been waiting patiently to be rediscovered. If you're still watching and feeling the quiet weight of her loneliness, comment one below so I know you're here with me. Now let's see what she discovers that will change everything. The afternoon I found the notebook. The sky hung low and gray over the water, pressing the world into a soft, colorless quiet. I had decided to sort through the last of the boxes stacked in the hallway, the ones I had avoided since moving into this house. They contained the unfinished business of earlier versions of my life. Old photographs, tax records, greeting cards, and objects that once felt too important to discard. Dust lifted into the light as I opened the first box. I moved slowly, not searching for anything in particular, only trying to create a sense of order. At the bottom of a smaller carton, beneath a stack of yellowed envelopes, I found a cloth-bound notebook with frayed corners and a faint ring from a long, evaporated coffee cup. I recognized it immediately. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down, tracing the worn edge bar with my thumb before opening it. Inside were pages filled with careful handwriting, slanted slightly to the right, the script of a younger woman who believed time was generous. There were character sketches, fragments of scenes, and observations about people on buses, in grocery stores, in waiting rooms. Tucked into the inside cover was a folded sheet of paper. When I opened it, I saw my college literature professor's handwriting, praising my sense of emotional detail and encouraging me to continue writing. I had not thought about those words in decades. Back then, I imagined a life shaped by storytelling. Then came marriage, bills, responsibility, and the steady logic of survival. Dreams did not disappear all at once. They dissolved slowly, replaced by practical decisions that felt necessary at the time. I sat for a long while reading the pages. The themes were unmistakable: overlooked lives, quiet resilience, moments of dignity that passed without recognition. Even then, I had been drawn to stories others might miss. By the time the light began to fade, the house had fallen into its familiar silence. Yet something about the quiet felt charged rather than empty. I opened my laptop at the end of the table, intending only to preserve a few passages from the notebook. Instead, I found myself typing a new sentence. I described a small coastal town where fog rolled in without warning and driftwood gathered along rocky beaches. I introduced a woman in her 60s who noticed details others ignored: a misplaced boat rope, a light burning in an empty house, the faint tension beneath polite conversations. She was observant and self-possessed, qualities I admired but had never claimed for myself. I paused, embarrassed by the audacity of beginning. Jason's comment about crowded book markets flickered through my thoughts, and for a moment I hovered over the delete key. Then I kept writing. The sound of the keys felt tentative, like water moving through pipes after a long winter freeze. The refrigerator hummed softly. Outside, gulls cried somewhere beyond the bluff. I lost track of time until the room darkened and the glow of the screen became the only light. When I finally stopped, I read the page again. I did not feel pride or certainty, only a quiet recognition, as if I had stepped into a room I once knew by heart. I saved the document, hesitating before naming the file. I chose something simple, unsure whether I would return to it. That night, lying in bed, I listened to the distant tide pulling against the shore. The silence of the house no longer felt hollow. It felt expectant, as though something small but necessary had begun. If you're still watching and sensing that this small decision might reshape her life, comment 2 below to stay with the journey. Now, let's see what happens when her private dream meets the outside world. In the weeks after I began writing, My days settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and quietly sustaining. I woke early, walked along the narrow stretch of shoreline below the bluff, and listened to the tide folding itself against the stones. By the time I returned home, the air smelled faintly of salt and cedar, and the small kitchen felt warm as I poured coffee and opened my laptop. I wrote through the late morning and into the afternoon, pausing only when the light shifted across the floor or my hands grew stiff. The story deepened in ways I had not expected. The coastal town I described grew more vivid with each page, its fog-bound mornings and weathered docks taking shape in my imagination. At its center stood an older woman who noticed details others dismissed: a skiff tied with the wrong knot, a porch light glowing in an empty house, the tension behind polite smiles at the local market. She asked questions people preferred to avoid. She trusted her observations. In writing her, I realized I was exploring the quiet erasure that comes with age and the hidden fractures beneath carefully maintained civility. Finishing the manuscript felt less like triumph than exposure. When I typed the final sentence, I sat motionless, my hands resting in my lap. Completion meant the story could now be judged. I printed the pages and stacked them neatly on the table, where they remained untouched for nearly 2 weeks. Each time I passed them, I felt a small tightening in my chest. Eventually, I forced myself to learn what came next. I read about query letters, submission guidelines, and the intricate pathways of publishing. The terminology felt foreign, as if I were studying the customs of a distant country. I drafted a letter introducing my work and revised it repeatedly, trying to sound confident without sounding foolish. When I finally sent the first submission, my finger hovered over the trackpad before I pressed send, aware that something private had just entered the world. The replies arrived slowly. They were courteous and brief, thanking me while declining the manuscript. Each message eroded a thin layer of confidence I had not realized was fragile. I wondered whether I had mistaken personal healing for literary merit. I wrote less, though I did not stop entirely. Then, one gray morning, an email appeared from a small independent publisher in Portland, Oregon. The editor expressed interest and asked to see the full manuscript. I reread the message several times, certain I had misunderstood. When I attached the file and sent it, my pulse beat loudly in my ears. The waiting that followed felt suspended between hope and caution. I tried to occupy myself with routine, though my attention drifted toward the inbox more often than I cared to admit. At the suggestion of a former colleague from the library, I shared a brief excerpt in a community newsletter for older adults. A week later, a reader wrote to say the piece made her feel visible in a way she had not expected. I printed the email and kept it beside my computer. It reminded me that the story had already reached someone. Jason called one evening, and I mentioned the submission in passing. He spoke kindly about how competitive publishing could be and suggested I treat the effort as a pastime rather than an expectation. His practicality was familiar, and I let the subject fade. Late one night, a new message appeared. The publisher wished to offer a contract. I sat very still, absorbing the words until their meaning settled. When I looked up, the dark water beyond the window reflected only a faint ribbon of light. For the first time in years, I felt visible in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or sacrifice. If you're still watching and wondering whether hope can survive rejection, comment 3 below, so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to the moment that begins to test her confidence. The package arrived on a damp morning in early spring, its cardboard corners softened by coastal rain. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, aware that my hands were trembling slightly. For a long moment, I simply stood there, looking at the shipping label as if opening it too quickly might dissolve whatever waited inside. When I finally cut the tape and folded back the flaps, I saw the book resting in a bed of paper packing. I lifted it carefully. The cover was smooth beneath my fingertips, the title printed in quiet blue lettering above the name Evelyn Shore. Seeing that name felt strange and intimate at the same time, like meeting a version of myself who had been waiting patiently for years. I had chosen a pen name for practical reasons, the publisher said, but also for privacy. Yet I understood there was more to it than that. The name created a boundary between the woman who had spent decades being useful and the one who had begun to claim a voice of her own. The book felt heavier than I expected. I turned it over in my hands, inhaling the faint scent of ink and paper, and felt something settle quietly inside me. It was not pride exactly, but legitimacy. The first weeks after publication were quiet. I told myself I would not watch sales rankings, yet I found myself checking them more often than I intended. The numbers were modest, drifting somewhere far down the list where most books live and disappear. I reminded myself that I had written the story to express something true, not to chase recognition. Still, the silence stirred familiar doubts. One morning, while pouring coffee, I noticed a new review posted online. A retired nurse from Minnesota wrote that she was grateful to read a mystery centered on a woman her own age, someone neither comic relief nor background decoration. She wrote that the protagonist felt real. I read the review again and again, letting its sincerity steady something inside me that had long been fragile. I began the second book that same week. The process felt different this time. I understood the rhythm of the town and the cadence of my protagonist's thoughts. Writing no longer felt like stepping into darkness. It felt like continuing a conversation. Emails from readers began arriving through the publisher's website. Many came from women who described feeling invisible in their daily lives. They wrote about retirement, widowhood, children who lived far away, and the quiet erosion of being overlooked. Their words moved me deeply. I answered each message slowly and with care. Jason remained kind but distant regarding my writing. During a visit to Seattle, he introduced me to a colleague by saying I was enjoying retirement and keeping busy with writing projects. His tone was warm, yet the phrasing reduced my work to an activity rather than a vocation. I smiled and let the moment pass, telling myself he was speaking in the language he understood. His girlfriend, Melissa, asked whether my books were available locally and mentioned that her book club preferred faster-paced thrillers. She spoke lightly, without malice, but I felt the familiar sense of belonging to a different cultural current. A few weeks later, the publisher informed me that the first printing had sold steadily enough to warrant a second run. The numbers were modest, but the consistency suggested readers were finding the story and passing it along. I returned to my desk before sunrise the next morning. Pale light spread across the water outside, and the tide was slipping quietly away from the shore. When I opened a new document, my hands moved with a steadiness I had not felt before. My voice, once tentative, no longer felt like a visitor. If you're still watching and noticing how success doesn't always change family dynamics, comment 4 below to stay part of the story. Now, let's step into the night that will change everything. By the evening of the gala, spring rain had polished the streets of downtown Seattle into mirrors of light and motion. The hotel rose above the waterfront in a column of glass and steel, its lobby filled with soft illumination and the quiet confidence of wealth. I paused just inside the entrance, smoothing the sleeve of my dark blue dress, reminding myself that I was here because I had helped build this evening piece by piece. For 3 weeks, I had coordinated seating charts, vendor schedules, floral deliveries, and program revisions. My manuscript had remained closed on the desk at home while I tracked guest confirmations and dietary restrictions. Each task felt familiar, like stepping back into a life defined by usefulness rather than authorship. I told myself I was helping my son carry a burden he could not manage alone. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played near the far wall, their music drifting above the low murmur of conversation. Guests moved through the space in tailored suits and evening gowns, greeting one another with practiced ease. The air carried faint notes of expensive perfume and polished wood. Jason stood near the entrance beside his colleagues, greeting donors and investors with effortless confidence. When he saw me, he stepped forward and kissed my cheek. "Everything looks perfect, Mom. Thank you." Before I could answer, another guest approached, and he turned back to his professional smile. I found my place at a table near the rear of the room. From there, I could see the stage clearly while remaining outside the center of attention. I told myself I preferred it that way. Observing had always felt more natural than participating. Dinner unfolded smoothly. Laughter rose and fell around the room. I recognized several names from the guest list and watched their interactions with quiet interest, noticing the small gestures that revealed alliances and hierarchies. I felt a muted pride knowing the evening was proceeding without disruption. When the auction began, a professional auctioneer stepped onto the stage and immediately energized the room. Exclusive golf outings, luxury mountain retreats, and private dining experiences drew enthusiastic bidding. Paddle numbers lifted quickly, and applause followed each winning call. Jason stood near the stage, his posture relaxed and assured, each successful bid reinforcing the momentum of the night. As the final items concluded, Jason stepped forward to the microphone with a wide, playful smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have one last surprise item to close the evening." A ripple of amused anticipation moved through the room. He turned and looked directly toward me. "I am auctioning off lunch with my mom," he said lightly. "Starting bid $1. She is retired and writes little mystery stories, so she has plenty of free time." A few polite laughs surfaced, uncertain and brief. The humor landed awkwardly, like a note played off key. I felt the warmth rise into my face. My hands remained folded in my lap, fingers interlaced so tightly they ached. I kept my posture still, aware that any movement might draw further attention. No paddle lifted. The silence thickened. Guests shifted in their seats. Some studied their programs. Others glanced toward me and quickly away, their expressions caught between discomfort and pity. Jason's smile held, but I saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He scanned the room, waiting for someone to rescue the moment. No one did. The warmth that had filled the ballroom seemed to drain into a strained quiet. I felt myself reduced to a small point of awareness, conscious of my breathing, the weight of my hands, the echo of my own heartbeat. Weeks of work, years of sacrifice, and a lifetime of quiet endurance converged into that suspended silence. On stage, Jason's confidence began to fracture. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt dense enough to press against my skin. I remained seated, hands folded tightly in my lap, aware of the fragile stillness stretching between one breath and the next. On stage, Jason stood with the microphone lowered slightly, his confident expression suspended in uncertainty as he waited for a bid that did not come. Then a woman's voice, calm and unhurried, rose from the back of the room. $1 million. The words did not seem real at first. They hung in the air, detached from meaning, until the room collectively inhaled. Conversations halted mid-breath. Chairs shifted. Heads turned in unison toward the rear aisle. A woman stood near the back row, poised and composed. She appeared to be in her late 60s, dressed in a charcoal silk jacket that caught the chandelier light without drawing attention to itself. There was nothing theatrical in her posture, only a quiet authority that made the surrounding movement seem unnecessary. She began walking forward. Her steps were unhurried, deliberate against the polished marble floor. With each step, attention moved away from the stage and followed her progress. Jason lowered the microphone further, confusion overtaking the practiced ease he had worn moments earlier. When she reached the front, she turned slightly toward the audience before speaking. "My name is Margaret Ellison," she said. "I am an executive producer with Silvercrest Streaming." A murmur moved through the room. Several guests exchanged looks of recognition. One of the senior partners leaned toward his wife and whispered something I could not hear. Margaret turned toward me rather than toward Jason. "For the past several weeks," she continued, "our development team has been attempting to reach the author Evelyn Shore regarding a limited series adaptation of her coastal mystery novels. We were informed she was unavailable due to family obligations. Given our production timeline, I decided to locate her personally." Confusion spread in visible waves. A few guests lifted their phones. Someone behind me whispered the name Evelyn Shore aloud, testing it against recognition. Margaret's gaze remained steady. "Ms. Harper is the sole rights holder to the intellectual property. Without her participation, the project cannot proceed. My bid is simply to ensure we secure the meeting we have been trying to arrange." A soft gasp sounded from a nearby table. Another voice murmured that their book club had read the novels. A woman across the room stared openly at me, her expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. Jason stood motionless, the microphone resting uselessly at his side. The confidence that had filled his posture only minutes earlier seemed to dissolve, leaving him pale and uncertain. Margaret continued, her tone unchanged. "I read the first book while undergoing chemotherapy last year. The clarity and resilience of its protagonist provided comfort during a difficult time. My interest is professional, but it is also deeply personal." The room seemed to exhale. What had begun as strained silence softened into recognition. Applause began tentatively from somewhere near the front, then spread outward, gathering strength. Several guests rose to their feet. The senior partner inclined his head toward me with unmistakable respect. I remained seated, absorbing the shift. The heat of humiliation receded, replaced by a steady calm I did not recognize, but trusted. Jason lowered the microphone completely. For the first time in his career, he appeared unsure how to proceed. Margaret extended her hand toward me, not urgently, but with patient respect. I rose slowly from my chair as the applause continued around me. The sound filled the ballroom, yet inside I felt an unfamiliar stillness, as though the space I occupied in the world had quietly, irrevocably changed. If you're still watching and felt the shock of that life-changing reveal, comment 6 below to let me know you're still here. Now let's move into Chapter 7 and see how the aftermath unfolds. I woke the next morning to a pale wash of light spreading across the bedroom ceiling, unsure for a moment where I was or what had changed. The quiet of the house felt familiar, yet my body carried the memory of applause, of suspended silence, of a room full of strangers rising to their feet. The tide moved somewhere beyond the bluff, and the distant call of a gull anchored me in the present. My phone lay on the nightstand, its dark screen filled with notifications, missed calls, voicemails, emails from unfamiliar addresses. For a moment, I simply looked at the glowing icons without touching them, as if opening the messages might pull the outside world too quickly into the stillness of the morning. Instead, I dressed and went to the kitchen. The ritual of making coffee steadied me. Water heating, the soft hiss of the kettle, the faint earthy scent rising from the mug. I carried it to the table and sat down, allowing the quiet to settle before inviting anything else into the day. The previous evening returned in fragments rather than a single memory. The warmth rising in my face, the weight of silence pressing inward, the calm voice from the back of the room, the shift in air as recognition replaced discomfort. I understood now that the applause had not been for spectacle. It had been for the restoration of dignity in a moment when it had been publicly diminished. When I finally checked my phone, the volume of messages felt surreal. My literary agent had called twice. My publisher had sent an email marked urgent. Several unknown numbers had left brief voicemails requesting interviews or statements. I set the phone down again. I needed a few more moments of ordinary quiet before stepping into whatever waited beyond it. Late in the morning, my neighbor Carol waved from across the driveway as she collected her mail. She asked if I had seen the online post circulating about a charity gala in Seattle, where a streaming executive had bid $1 million for a meeting with an author. Her tone was curious rather than intrusive. I smiled and said the internet had a way of exaggerating things. She nodded, satisfied, and wished me a good day. Inside, I sat at my desk and opened the manuscript for the next book. The cursor blinked steadily, patient and unhurried. My mind, however, lingered on the precarious nature of reputation. In Jason's profession, credibility was currency. Trust could take years to build and seconds to erode. I did not feel vindictive toward him, only aware that respect, once compromised, required deliberate repair. Emails from readers began arriving through the contact form on my website. Many wrote not about the gala, but about feeling invisible in their own lives. Several mentioned watching the moment unfold online and admiring the composure they believed they saw. Their words carried a quiet solidarity that moved me more than praise ever could. Jason did not call that morning. His silence was not absence, but process. I sensed he was confronting the consequences of a moment that had escaped his control. By afternoon, my agent left another message emphasizing the urgency of returning calls regarding the adaptation discussions. I listened, then set the phone aside once more. I wanted my first response to come from steadiness rather than reaction. I walked down to the shoreline as the tide receded, revealing dark stones slick with seawater and strands of kelp draped like ribbons across the sand. The exposed ground felt like a mirror of my own life, surfaces revealed that had long remained hidden. Standing at the water's edge, I realized the previous night had not changed who I was. It had revealed who I had been becoming. Attention and opportunity had arrived together. What came next would require clarity, boundaries, and a courage that did not ask permission to exist. The doorbell rang earlier than I expected anyone to visit. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window, pale and steady, and for a moment I stood still beside the counter, listening to the quiet house before crossing the floor. When I opened the door, Jason stood on the porch in jeans and a windbreaker, his hair uncombed, his posture uncertain in a way I had rarely seen. He stepped inside without his usual efficiency, pausing just beyond the threshold, as if unsure where to place himself. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread. He looked around the small room, his eyes resting briefly on the stack of manuscript pages at the end of the table before he sat down. His hands clasped together, then separated, then clasped again. "The partners spoke to me after the gala," he began, his voice low. "They said my judgment reflected poorly on the firm. In our business, respect and discretion are not optional." He paused, studying the grain of the tabletop. I thought I was being charming. Hearing it described afterward, I realized it was cruel. I sat across from him, my hands folded around my mug. I listened without interrupting. The urge to reassure him rose instinctively, a reflex shaped by years of smoothing his childhood disappointments, but I let the silence remain. He inhaled slowly. I have spent years trying to fit into rooms where everyone seems polished and effortless. I did not want anyone to see where I came from. Minimizing my background made it easier to belong. His eyes lifted briefly toward mine. In doing that, I diminished you? The words hung between us, unadorned and heavy. I thought about how shame often disguises itself as ambition, how the desire to belong can quietly rewrite loyalties. I love you, I said at last, my voice steady. But I cannot keep shrinking my life to make yours more comfortable. My work is not a pastime. My time is not endlessly available. He nodded, absorbing the words without protest. There was something else I needed to say. While reviewing the Gala documents, I noticed the startup is involved in a patent dispute. If that information surfaces without preparation, it could damage investor trust and expose the company to serious legal risk. Jason's expression shifted from fatigue to alarm. We were told not to raise that issue before the event, he admitted. They did not want to frighten donors. Transparency protects credibility, I said. Concealment rarely does. Addressing the risk directly will protect everyone involved. He sat back, exhaling slowly. I could see the recalibration happening behind his eyes, the recognition that I was speaking not only as his mother, but as someone capable of perceiving what he had overlooked. I am sorry, he said quietly, not just for the auction, for the way I have treated what you do and who you are. I did not rush to absolve him. Change is shown in what we do next, I replied. We sat together a few moments longer, the tension easing into something more breathable. When he stood to leave, he paused at the doorway. Thank you, he said, for more than I realized. After he left, the house returned to its familiar quiet, but it no longer felt strained. I returned to my desk and opened my manuscript. My hands rested on the keyboard as I considered the morning's conversation and the themes threading through my work: dignity, visibility, and the courage to be seen. When I began typing, my voice carried a steadiness shaped not by recognition alone, but by self-respect. If you're still watching and feeling the shift between apology and true change, comment 8 below, so I know you're ready for the conclusion. Now, let's move toward the final outcome of this journey. Several weeks passed after Jason's visit, and the rhythm of my days settled into something steadier than before. The house overlooking Puget Sound remained quiet, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt purposeful, like a pause between sentences rather than an unfinished thought. My mornings began with coffee and a review of notes from calls with my literary agent and the production team in Los Angeles. Their conversations were precise and energetic, filled with discussions of episode arcs, character continuity, and visual tone. Hearing professionals speak about my fictional town as though it were a living place still startled me, yet I understood that what drew them to the story was not spectacle, but emotional truth. I listened carefully during those calls, asking questions when necessary. I wanted the adaptation to preserve the dignity of the characters and the quiet tension of the coastal setting. The fog, the ferry horns at dawn, the stillness before a storm, these details were not decorative. They were the emotional weather of the story. Reader messages continued to arrive through my website. Many wrote to say they had begun painting again, enrolled in community college classes, or finally set boundaries with adult children who assumed their availability. I began to understand that the books had become more than mysteries. They had become permission. Jason's voice sounded different on the phone now. He called without an agenda and did not rush the silence between sentences. He asked about my writing and listened to the answer rather than steering the conversation elsewhere. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. One evening, he mentioned a small dinner with colleagues and said he had introduced me as the author Evelyn Shore. He spoke the name without hesitation, as if it had always belonged in his vocabulary. I did not comment, but I felt the quiet significance of the shift. The patent dispute at his firm was addressed with transparency. A public statement acknowledged the issue and outlined steps toward resolution. Investor confidence steadied rather than faltered. Jason later told me that clarity had strengthened trust. His voice carried a note of humility that had not been there before. Location scouts from the production company arrived on a misty morning. I walked with them along the shoreline, pointing out the way fog settles in layers over the water and how the tide exposes dark stones veined with barnacles. I described the smell of tidal mud and the low, resonant call of fairy horns before sunrise. Watching them translate these details into camera notes felt quietly astonishing. Jason visited Tacoma one weekend with no business obligations. We shared soup at the kitchen table and spoke about ordinary things. A new bakery near his office, a neighbor's dog that had learned to open gates, the sudden brightness of early summer light. The ease between us felt unfamiliar, but welcome. At dawn the following week, I sat at my desk revising a chapter of my new manuscript. Pale light spread across the water as the tide turned. I realized my life now held work, purpose, and relationships grounded in mutual respect. Dignity restored was not a return to the past. It was the beginning of something different. Morning arrives gently along the edge of Puget Sound. Pale light slips through the window above my desk, turning the surface of the water into a muted ribbon of silver. The tide is moving out, steady and unhurried, revealing dark stones that glisten briefly before drying in the open air. I have come to understand that this hour belongs to reflection as much as to beginning. In the months since the gala, my life has unfolded in ways I could not have predicted. Retirement once felt like an erasure, a quiet fading into the margins of other people's lives. I had measured my worth by usefulness, by how efficiently I could solve problems, organize schedules, and meet the needs of those I loved. When those demands disappeared, I mistook the silence for emptiness. Writing changed that silence. It asked me to sit still long enough to hear my own thoughts. It required me to consider who I was when I was not needed by anyone else. The answer did not arrive quickly. It emerged line by line, in the voice of a fictional woman who refused to overlook what others ignored. The night of the gala remains vivid in my memory, not because of the humiliation itself, but because of what it revealed. For years, I had accepted small diminishments in the name of harmony. I believed shrinking myself made life easier for the people around me. In truth, it diminished us all. Respect cannot grow in spaces where self-erasure is mistaken for kindness. Recognition did not change me. It revealed the person I had been becoming in quiet increments. The woman who chose to write, who answered reader letters with care, who refused to apologize for occupying space in the world. The letters continue to arrive. Women write about returning to abandoned dreams, enrolling in classes, painting again, setting boundaries with adult children who assume their endless availability. They do not describe grand transformations. They describe small acts of reclamation. I recognize those acts as courage. Jason and I are learning a different language with one another. Our conversations are slower now, less guarded. Respect has replaced efficiency. We do not pretend the past did not shape us, but we no longer allow it to define the limits of who we can become. Adulthood between parent and child is not a return to earlier roles. It is an agreement to meet each other where we stand. I often think of Margaret Ellison reading my book during chemotherapy treatments. The knowledge that my words accompanied someone through fear reframed my understanding of success. Visibility is fleeting. Impact endures quietly, often unseen by the person who creates it. The adaptation project moves forward with careful deliberation. I walk the shoreline with producers and describe the way fog settles in layers over the water, how the air smells before rain, how silence can hold both comfort and warning. These details matter because they carry emotional truth, and truth is what allows stories to travel beyond their origins. Yet the center of my life remains unchanged. Each morning I return to the desk, open my manuscript, and begin again. Writing is not an escape from life. It is a way of inhabiting it more fully. If there is anything these past months have taught me, it is that invisibility is not an inevitable condition. It is a perception shaped by habit, expectation, and fear. When we claim our voices, even quietly, the world adjusts its focus. Outside the window, the tide turns. Light spreads across the widening water, illuminating a horizon that remains open and unknowable. I sit with my hands resting on the keyboard, aware of the steady rhythm of breath and the gentle movement of the sea. There is still more to write. There is still more life ahead. In the end, the most meaningful victories are not the ones measured in applause or recognition, but the quiet moments when a person reclaims their own voice. A life can unfold in predictable patterns for decades, shaped by duty, sacrifice, and the expectations of others, until one day, a simple act of courage shifts the lens through which everything is seen. Dignity is not granted by the world. It is restored the moment we stop shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. Age does not diminish worth, and silence does not erase significance. When we honor our own truth, we make space for others to do the same. If this story resonated with you, thank you for spending this time here. Your thoughts and experiences matter, so please share them in the comments and consider following and subscribing for more stories that remind us it is never too late to be seen.